Most of the cases profiled in this series involve police investigations of one type or another. In the simplest terms, investigations are conducted to identify and arrest a suspect in a crime. Often, when the police begin an investigation, they know, or think they know, who the culprit is, but need to compile evidence that will lead to an arrest and conviction. In real life, murder investigations and trials can be quite complex and often endure over the course of several months or even years. The investigations themselves can often be problematic. The most apparent problems that arise in any murder case concern the evidence. Sometimes there appears to be an abundance of physical evidence, but upon further examination, it is revealed that the evidence has been degraded due to time or the elements. Even with the phenomenal advances that have been made in forensic science over the last 30 years, science does have limits. Other investigations are hampered due to a lack of physical evidence. Crafty criminals who are versed in police procedures have shown an amazing ability to circumvent forensic examinations of their deeds, and in some cases there is simply no evidence left at the scene. But physical or forensic evidence is not the only type of evidence investigators use. Long before forensic science, investigators often had to rely on eyewitness testimony to make arrests. Of course, there are many inherent problems with eyewitness evidence though. For instance, many crimes are committed with no eyewitnesses around, and studies have shown that eyewitness testimony is often flawed. Also, many times eyewitnesses are simply too afraid to come forward with their accounts. All of these factors contribute to creating nightmares for homicide investigators, but perhaps the most frustrating obstacle a detective faces is a victim with no name. Unfortunately, there are millions of people who live on the fringes of society in the United States without proper identification. When these people become murder victims, the investigating detectives are often faced with their most difficult investigations. The investigators may quickly learn how the victim died, or even when he or she died, but the lack of a positive identity often prevents the investigation from progressing. Who would have had a motive to kill this person? Who were this person's enemies? Was this person involved in a love triangle or shady business dealings? When questions such as these cannot be answered, the case in question often turns cold. This was the situation in one of the strangest murder cases profiled in this series. On January 2nd, 1935, a mysterious young man checked into the Hotel President in downtown Kansas City, Kansas. He never checked out. It was later determined that the young man was beaten and stabbed to death during his stay, but it was the details surrounding the cases, or the lack thereof, which made this crime truly mysterious. No killer or killers were ever caught in connection to the crime, and in fact no suspects were ever publicly identified, which all stemmed from the fact that the identity of the victim was never positively determined. On the afternoon of New Year's Day, 1935, a tall, husky young man walked into the lobby of the Hotel President in Kansas City and asked for a room. Although the young man was later described as decent-looking, he had a somewhat intimidating demeanour. He spoke in concise, matter-of-fact sentences, and his eye contact never wavered from those for whom he was speaking. His intimidating facade was also at least partially due to the fact that he had a cauliflower ear and a long scar on the side of his head. He signed the guest registry as Ronald T. Owen from Los Angeles, but never showed a driver's license. Hotel guests were rarely asked to provide identification back then, as hotels and motels were often viewed as places where a person could get away from his or her normal life. To those who met Owen, it seemed as though he too was running from something. Owen told the bellboy on duty that he would have rather stayed at another hotel downtown, but didn't want to pay $5 a night. Hotel rooms were much cheaper, like everything else was in 1935 during the Great Depression. When asked if he had a preference for floors, Owen replied that he wanted a room that faced the inner courtyard of the hotel instead of the street. The concierge didn't think much of the request at the time. He had seen and heard many more outlandish requests in his time at the hotel, so he simply fulfilled Mr. Owen's request. The bellboy was a bit surprised that Owen had no bags, but again, he'd seen plenty of guests with no luggage, so he brought the guest to the room. After the bellboy showed Owen the room and gave him the key, Owen took a comb, toothbrush, and a brush from his overcoat pockets and put the items on the bathroom sink. He then told the bellboy that he wanted some clean towels. Later that day, a maid came to room 1046 with some towels and to see if the guest needed anything else. The maid thought it was strange that the guest had all of the lights turned off, except for a lamp on a table. The guest said little to the maid other than he needed the door to the room to remain unlocked. Owen was adamant that the door is unlocked. but he never said why. When the maid was dropping off the towels to Owen's room, she noticed a handwritten note illuminated by the lamp that said, "Don, I'll be back in 15 minutes, wait." During the next day, there was plenty of activity in and around room 1046. Another bellboy who was working on the floor happened to overhear Owen on the telephone saying, "No, Don, I don't want to eat, I am not hungry, I just had breakfast." Normally the conversation would not have been something that caught the bellboy's attention, but he thought it was odd since he didn't see any food in Mr. Owen's room and he hadn't left the room yet that day. Later in the day, while he was walking down the hallway, the bellboy heard two men having a conversation in room 1046. Room 1046 was then quiet until the evening. A woman who was staying in the room next to Owen's later reported to the police that she heard a man and a woman arguing in room 1046 that night, but paid little attention to it at the time. There was also a report of a loud party on the floor that night, and another report of a prostitute wandering the floor looking for a client. It is unknown if these two events were related at all to the enigmatic Mr. Owen's stay at the hotel. Owen was last seen that evening around 11 p.m. a few blocks from the hotel when he flagged down a car he thought was a taxi. The man let Owen into his car and was immediately struck by the young man's appearance. He was wearing no overcoat during a Missouri winter and was bleeding from his arm. When asked about the wound, Owen only said that he was going to kill the person who did it. The driver dropped Owen off at the hotel president and never saw him again. Around 7 a.m. the next day, the hotel switchboard operator noticed that the phone in room 1046 was off the hook. Bellboy Randall Propst was sent to the room to see what the problem was, but when he arrived, the room was locked with a "Do Not Disturb" sign posted on the door handle. Propst yelled for the guest to put the phone back on the hook and left to do other work. A couple of hours later, the switchboard operator noticed that the phone in room 1046 was still off the hook. Another bellboy was sent to the room, but it was still locked, so he used a passkey to enter. The bellboy noticed that the room was a bit messy and that Mr. Owen appeared to be naked and passed out drunk on his bed. He put the phone back on the hook and left. Around 11 a.m, the switchboard operator noticed that the phone in room 1046 was once more off the hook. Propst was sent back to the room to rectify the situation, but oddly the room door was now unlocked. He went inside to put the phone on the hook and immediately noticed a bloody Owen laying on the floor, with his hands on his head. Owen told Propst that he fell against the bathtub and required medical attention. Owen was brought to the nearest hospital where he died later that evening. As strange as the murder case of Roland T. Owen began, it got much more bizarre during the course of the investigation. At first, the police were unsure if they had an accident on their hands, as Owen claimed, or if it was something much more nefarious. The initial investigation quickly determined that it was the latter. In 1935, homicide investigators didn't have the luxury of advanced forensic science to help them solve cases as their counterparts do today, but they did have other tools at their disposal. Homicide investigators employed the same tried-and-true investigation methods that have been successful throughout time, and they were unhampered by civilian oversight and laws such as Miranda versus Arizona once they had a suspect. But finding a suspect in Roland Owen's murder would prove to be elusive. Upon entering room 1046, it quickly became apparent that Owen was murdered. There was blood on the walls and ceilings, most of it dry, which led the investigators to conclude that the fatal attack happened hours before Propst found Owen in a stupor. Owen was attacked and left for dead before he apparently tried to call someone for help. It is believed that he knew his attacker or attackers, and for whatever reason he refused to reveal their identities to the police. It also became apparent that the killer or killers may have been in Owen's room longer than the hotel staff had originally believed. The phone probably was knocked off the hook in the early morning hours during the assault. The attacker or attackers then left the room and placed the "Do Not Disturb" sign on the door in order to give themselves time to get away. After the phone was put back on the hook, Owen may have tried calling a doctor for help, but was unable to complete the call, passed out from blood loss, and left the phone off the hook once more. Before he passed out, Owen either unlocked the door for some reason that will remain a mystery, or the bellboy who was there the second time that morning didn't lock the door on the way out. Or the killer or killers were hiding in the room somewhere and he didn't see them. The chronology of the events was certainly baffling and seemed to confuse more than clarify things. A number of other small clues were discovered in the hotel room that helped investigators piece together Owen's last few hours of life. A hairpin was found on the floor, which indicated that a woman was in the room at some point during the 2 days. There were also 4 unidentified fingerprints on the lamp Owen used. Due to the small size of the fingerprints, the investigators believed they were left by a woman. Finally, there was a label from a tie on the floor and an unsmoked cigarette. It did not appear that Owen was a smoker, and the label didn't belong to the tie he was wearing, so it is believed that there was another man as well, a woman, in the room, which would fit the eyewitness accounts of hearing both male and female voices in room 1046. The police actually had a fair amount of physical evidence at their disposal, but their investigation was stymied by the fact that they couldn't identify their victim. He had no identification on him, nor any personal effects that could point toward a possible identity. Within days, the police found themselves at an impasse in the Roland T. Owen murder investigation. The murder took place before televisions were common, and decades before television shows such as Unsolved Mysteries and America's Most Wanted helped investigators solve cases through nationwide tip lines. The only forms of mass media available at the time were radio and newspapers. The Kansas City police put Owen's body on display at a local funeral home, hoping that some locals would recognize the murder victim. A sketch artist was also hired to draw a portrait of Owen that was published in the Kansas City Daily newspaper. A number of tips were generated. It turned out that Owen had used several different aliases around Kansas City, and that he was often seen in the company of young, attractive women. The police began thinking that Owen was the victim of a love triangle gone wrong, but just when they were about to move on that theory, they received a number of other tips that sent the investigation into several different directions. One of the stranger tips that was made during the months immediately after the murder was publicised was from a local professional wrestling promoter. The promoter claimed that Owen was a former wrestler named Cecil Warner. The Kansas City police followed up the wrestling tip but determined that Warner and Owen were not the same man. In March 1935, a man called the Kansas City Police Department switchboard, claiming that the murder victim found in room 1046 was his brother-in-law and that his name actually was Roland T. Owen. The caller told the police that he wanted to remain anonymous and offered few details other than to say that Owen had been in trouble with some people in the criminal underworld. He added that the investigators were on the wrong track concerning the love triangle theory. Another major twist in the investigation came when money was sent to the Kansas City Police Department for Owen's burial with no return address. The police honoured the wish of whoever sent the money by arranging for the burial and even having a short funeral ceremony. The ceremony was conducted not so much for the deceased, but more so with the hope that Owen's killer, or someone who may have known about his murder, would attend. Before the ceremony was conducted, a bouquet of roses was sent to the funeral home conducting the burial for Owen with the note, "Love forever, Louise." Only the investigators attended Owen's funeral. As Roland T. Owen's murder investigation limped along throughout 1935, it seemed clear to many that the case would probably never be solved, largely due to the fact that Owen, or whatever his name was, could not be positively identified. Late in the year, though, the police received what seemed to be their most credible tip concerning Owen's true identity. A middle-aged woman named Ruby Ogletree contacted the Kansas City police and told them that Owen was really her son, Artemus Ogletree. According to Ruby, Artemus left their Birmingham, Alabama home in 1934 at the age of 17 to find adventure and make a life for himself in the midst of the Great Depression. Ruby Ogletree was adamant that her son was the man shown in the pictures in the newspapers as Roland T. Owen. Although many people believed Ruby's story and considered the identity of Owen solved, a number of loose ends remained. Ruby received 3 typewritten letters from someone claiming to be Artemus Ogletree in the months after Owen's murder. At first glance, it seemed as though Ogletree and Owen were 2 different men, but Ruby pointed out that her son didn't know how to type. Of course, Ogletree could have had someone type the letter for him, but why? Ruby also received a phone call from a man who claimed Ogletree had saved his life and was now living in Egypt. Ruby Ogletree never again heard from her son. Many now believe that Owen and Ogletree were the same man, and that the letters and phone calls were hoaxed by his killer or killers. The theory is certainly plausible, and even seems probable in light of the evidence, but it still remains just a theory. The reality was that Ronald T. Owen, or Artemus Ogletree, or whatever his name was like many young men his age during the Great Depression. Due to the lack of work and money in the country, young men often had to travel just to get by, and some found it convenient to use aliases, for whatever reasons. With so many red herrings and dead ends, the Roland T. Owen murder mystery gradually sunk from the headlines and became a cold case. long before the term cold case was part of the standard police lexicon. But the case was not forgotten. The Owen murder case briefly emerged in the Kansas City headlines in 1937 when it was revealed that a similar murder had occurred in New York City that year. In the New York case, similar to the Owen case, a mysterious man with no known identity was killed in a hotel. Despite the outward similarities of the two cases, investigators couldn't find any conclusive evidence that linked the murders, so the New York murder was believed to have been a macabre coincidence. The Kansas City investigators received another red herring in 2003 when an anonymous call was made to the Kansas City Library by a man claiming to have important information regarding the Owen murder case. The caller said that he had been going through the possessions of a recently deceased family member when he discovered a box full of news articles and press clippings related to the Owen case. The tip was followed up, but the person in question was determined to be unrelated to the case. Today, even with the immense amount of advanced forensic technology at investigators' disposal, it seems doubtful that the mystery of Roland T. Owen's murder will ever be solved. Hey friends, thank you for listening to today's story. Make sure to click the notification icon to stay updated on all future narrations. I release new videos twice every day at 10 AM and 8 PM Eastern Time. If you have a story to share, please send it to the email displayed on the screen. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give this video a like and leave an encouraging comment. It really helps me keep bringing you more narrations like this. If you'd like to support the channel even more, you can get early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.